Morning. Welcome to AEI on this beautiful July morning, one of those rare beautiful July mornings in Washington, D.C. I'm Andrew Kelly. I'm the director of the Center on Higher Education Reform here at AEI, and I have the honor today of introducing Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, chairman of the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Senator Alexander was kind enough to take some time away from his busy schedule working on the Every Child Achieves Act, which, if I'm not mistaken, is up for a vote today, to talk with us about the next big item on his agenda, the renewal of the Higher Education Act. It's an opportune time to be having this conversation. College affordability is quickly becoming a defining middle-class issue. Americans feel that some education after high school is both necessary but far too expensive, and they are looking to our leaders for solutions. Luckily for us, Senator Alexander is on the case. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody better qualified in terms of both experience and attitude to take on these challenges. When it comes to higher education, Senator Alexander's resume is not just unique, it is literally one of a kind. In addition to leading the HELP Committee, he has served as the governor of Tennessee, the president of the University of Tennessee, and Secretary of Education here in Washington. In short, he's seen this issue from all angles. And he's shown a willingness to work across the aisle, which is all too rare in Congress these days, most recently on the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and also on a proposal to simplify the free application for federal student aid with Senator Michael Bennett. I'm as eager to hear what Senator Alexander has to say as you all are, so I'll get out of the way after three quick announcements. The event today will be live streamed, and you can tweet using the hashtag Alexander at AEI. Please silence your cell phones. And the last is, after Senator Alexander's remarks, we will open it up for Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please wait for the mic. Identify yourself by name and affiliation. After the questions conclude, please stay seated until the senator has left the room. The panel discussion will follow immediately after. With that, please join me in welcoming Senator Alexander.
This is a little like ascending a church pulpit, so thank you. Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be here and great to be at AEI, an organization for which I have lots of respect. And I have great respect for our institutions of higher education. As Dr. Kelly said, I was once president of the University of Tennessee. That's harder than it looks, to be president of a higher education institution. I remember on my first day on campus, a faculty member came up to me and said, I was very enthusiastic that day, and she said, you have so much enthusiasm, you remind me of Clark Kerr. And I said, well, thank you very much, because Clark Kerr was the distinguished president of the University of California at one time. And I said, how is that? She said, you know, he arrived and left the same way, fired with enthusiasm. So it's a precarious existence, most college presidents will tell you. I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal last week in which I urged politicians and some pundits to stop telling students they cannot afford a college education. And I noted that 2 years of community college are free, or nearly free, for low-income students, given that tuition fees across the country average $3,300, and that the average Pell Grant is about the same. Public four-year colleges average about $9,000 tuition and fees. I wrote that the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, which is closer to $12,000, nearly every in-state student has a state Hope Scholarship. A third have Pell Grants, and many have access to state aid. So about 75% of all college students attend those public institutions. Even many of the private elite colleges have programs to help families figure out what they can afford to borrow, and then those institutions, such as Georgetown University, make up the difference. Many students borrow money for college, but the average four-year graduate's debt is about $27,000, or roughly the same as an average new car loan. And for that investment, you get a college degree that the College Board still says will earn you $1 million more over your lifetime than if you hadn't earned the degree. The problem, I explained in the op-ed that I wrote, is that we need to grow the percentage of Americans with college degrees over the next 5 years. Otherwise, we're on track to fall short by about 5 million workers with degrees. So politicians, in my view, should stop discouraging students from attending college, especially low-income students who are likely to benefit the most from the federal aid and may also be the most easily discouraged. Well, on Tuesday, the Wall Street Journal ran the letters to the editor in response to my op-ed. Here's a sampling from one, quote, Lamar Alexander has been a politician so long that he no longer understands that money comes from working people who understand what is expensive, and 4 years of college plus living expensive is expensive. From another, the traditional system is unsustainable. From another, politicians should stop talking about a college premium at all because the costs, even with all the subsidies, exceed the benefits for many. And another, it is counterintuitive to many politicians, but the more affordable they try to make higher education, the less affordable it becomes. In other words, I hit a nerve. But buried at the bottom of those letters published by the Wall Street Journal was this brief line from a woman in San Diego. Years ago, she said, there was a bumper sticker. Think education is expensive? Try life without it. Still holds true and always will. I've always said that it is never easy to pay for college. It's just easier than most people think. And as we approach the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in the Senate Education Committee, I don't pretend that our system is not in need of reforms. But let's begin with the shared recognition that life without education is more expensive, and that the cost to our country will be great if we don't increase the number of Americans with post-secondary education and degrees. And so then let's look at the measures that the federal government can take to encourage colleges to control their costs, operate more efficiently, help students graduate more quickly with less debt, and let's be sure that all these measures do nothing to challenge the autonomy and independence which is at the heart of the American higher education system. The autonomy and independence that have driven our colleges and universities to create the best system of higher education in the world. So I'd like to focus on 4 goals for the authorization that we're working on. First, ending the overregulation, or at least reducing the overregulation of colleges and universities. 2, ending the federal collection and dissemination of useless data. 3, improving our accreditation system. And 4, ensuring that institutions begin sharing in the risk of lending to students. So let's take the first one, ending the overregulation of colleges. Now, I'm here today as a Republican, speaking to a generally conservative audience about reducing regulations. Not a new idea for most of us. But there's an important distinction in this. We already have bipartisan support in the committee for reducing these regulations. Senator Mikulski, Senator Bennett, Senator Burr, and I commissioned a report 2 years ago on higher education regulations by a task force of educators, and we asked for specific recommendations on how to reduce the regulations. I said, we don't want another sermon. Tell us exactly what we could do to reduce the regulatory burden. And we got back 59 recommendations, 10 listed as priorities. A dozen of them are things that the U.S. Secretary of Education himself could do, and the rest would require some sort of congressional action. We're currently working on drafting legislation that adopts and implements many of the report's recommendations. The report told us that the higher education system is entangled in, the report's words, a jungle of red tape, and that every workday, each one of our 6,000 higher education institutions gets a letter or a guidance or a new rule from the U.S. Department of Education. On average, every workday, every one of our institutions, 6,000 of them, get a letter or a guidance or a new rule from the U.S. Department of Education that presumably changes their procedures. Here are 3 examples of how that plays out in our colleges. First, Vanderbilt University, because the chancellor of Vanderbilt was one of the co-chairs of our group making these recommendations. The other was the chancellor of the University of Maryland. So Vanderbilt hired the Boston Consulting Group to tell the university just how much it cost Vanderbilt to comply with federal rules or regulations in 1 year, 2014. The startling answer, $150 million, $11,000 per student. $11,000 is more than the average tuition and fees at public universities in the United States. Second, here's the FAFSA form that 20 million Americans fill out every year. Some of you have seen it. I've got it somewhere here. This is the form 20 million Americans fill out every year in order to get a grant or loan to attend college. Now, most people fill it out online. Some financial aid officers disparage my doing this because they say it's not that hard to fill out. Maybe not for them. I mean, they've been working on it for years. But I've talked to students who've literally burst into tears over the complexity of this thing. The president of a community college in Memphis told me he thinks he loses 1,500 students a semester because this is simply such an intimidating list of questions. I'll get back to my place here. We had testimony in our Education Committee that said those 108 questions could be reduced to 2. One would be, what's the size of your family? And 2 would be, what's the size of your family income? And that would answer 95% of the questions that we need to know to go to college. Third, the government hands out about $24 billion in research dollars every year to colleges and universities through the National Institutes of Health. The National Academy of Sciences has a study group that's twice done a survey, and both times found that 42% of a principal investigator's time with federally funded research is spent on administrative tasks. If you could reduce that 42% to 40 or 35 or 30 or 25, we could free up hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions, for additional research. In other words, we can save time, energy, money, and encourage more college degrees if we reduce higher education regulations. My second goal is ending the federal collection and dissemination of useless data. We've had 5 hearings on higher education this year. Our third one was on consumer data. The federal government collects a lot of data from 6,000 institutions. At the hearing, I held up the data survey that each of our almost 1,000 public community colleges must fill out. It's similar to the surveys the other 5,000 colleges fill out. This one was 426 pages of data requirements and reporting instructions with 3,300 different necessary responses or inputs. Then there are the federally mandated college consumer disclosures. Those require a 900-page binder to show what one university with 2 campuses is required to disclose to consumers. The law and regulations prescribe a dizzying variety of ways the different disclosures must be sent to current students, and upon request of the public, items range from the useful and necessary, such as providing the terms and conditions of federal student aid, to such things as informing students when Constitution Day is. Not only do I question what is really necessary, but more important, how much of it's really useful to students making a college choice. And then, how might consumer information actually become more useful for prospective students, and what better information may be needed? What requirements can we eliminate? And on a separate issue, once we've collected the right data, how good are we at disseminating the data, at least in a way that you can understand it? The government's created tools from the College Navigator to the College Scorecard, but the government's really not very good at doing this. And students aren't really actually using those tools very much to choose among colleges. My third goal is to improve our accreditation system. We had a hearing on accreditation last month. I learned a lot, but our accreditation system has to improve because there's really no decent alternative. Congress can't monitor 6,000 colleges and universities. The Department of Education surely can't. Accreditation has to work. Here are a few areas I think could see improvement, and there seems to be some consensus about these. Getting accreditors back to focusing on quality and not all the other things that Congress has asked them to do over the years, such as reviewing fire codes and looking over an institution's finances. Changing the geographic nature of today's accreditation system. There seems to be less validity today for having regional accreditation agencies exclusively. When I was president of the University of Tennessee, I would look sometimes at the University of Illinois or the University of Michigan, the universities outside our region as peers. allowing accreditors to use more discretion in their oversight. In other words, using a lighter touch on some institutions, so accreditors can get more of their time and resources to institutions clearly in need of greater oversight and have the lighter touch on those that don't. My last goal is ensuring that students begin sharing in the risk of lending to students. We know that some students today are borrowing more than they should. According to the Department of Education, of the more than 41 million borrowers with outstanding student debt, about 7 million or 17% are currently in default, meaning they haven't made a payment in at least 9 months. The total amount of loans currently in default is $108 billion, or about 10% of the total outstanding balance of federal student loans, although the department said it eventually collects most of it. One way to address overborrowing is to ensure that colleges have some responsibility to, or vested interest in, encouraging students to borrow wisely, graduate on time, and be able to repay what they've earned. If colleges and universities have this incentive, it may not only help students make wiser decisions about how much to borrow, it could help reduce the cost of college, thereby reducing debt. For example, colleges might encourage students to complete their education more quickly. Today, nearly half of college students take longer than 6 years to complete a degree or never finish at all, and completion is important. Nearly 70% of those borrowers who default on their federal student loans never finish their education. At the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, they're now saying to students, you can take less than 15 hours if you want to, but you're going to pay for 15 hours every semester, whether you take it or not. That's 3 more hours than federal student aid requirements insist on. The chancellor told me not long ago that most students are now taking 15 hours, since they're paying for it anyway, and the graduation rate is edging up. I've also encouraged colleges and universities to explore a 3-year degree. The more rapidly you move through the system, the less expense you have, and the quicker you get into an earning capacity. I recently spoke at a graduation ceremony at Walters State Community College in Tennessee, where one of the graduates was also graduating from high school that week. Getting both degrees and also entering Purdue University as a second semester sophomore, saving that student an estimated $65,000. At another community college in Tennessee, 30% of the students at the community college were also in high school. There's a growing practice of what we call dual enrollment, and that permits students to spend less time and spend less money on college. And then the president of George Washington University once told me this, quote, he said, you could run 2 complete colleges here at his campus with 2 complete faculties in the facilities now used half the year for 1. That's without cutting the length of student vacations, increasing class size, or requiring faculty to teach more. One of the biggest wastes in higher education is the waste of use of facilities. Dartmouth, for example, saves 10 to 15 million per year, it estimates, by requiring 1 mandatory summer session for its students. Southern New Hampshire University's College for America just began offering a $10,000 bachelor degree. So we're working on a way to give colleges some skin in the game. Senator Reed of Rhode Island has one proposal. He wants to make colleges responsible for a portion of defaulted loans. That's a framework worth considering. Others may have different ideas. For me, what is clear is that a matter of principle and fairness, all institutions, whether public, private, or for-profit, should participate in this. I don't believe any institution should be exempt from those requirements that we may add to discourage overborrowing and reduce college costs, but it might be appropriate to consider establishing multiple models of risk sharing so that institutions with differing missions and student populations have different ways of complying. And we have to be very careful with risk sharing. We're talking about lots of money. We're talking about loaning more than $100 billion a year. We're talking about $33 or $4 billion a year in Pell Grants that you don't have to pay back. So if we, on the loaning of $100 billion a year, take some steps, it'll have a big effect at thousands of institutions and millions of students across the country. We want to be sure that we think about what the unintended consequences might be. Today, when I'm done, I'm going back to the floor of the Senate where we ought to complete work on our bill to fix No Child Left Behind, which I've worked on with Senator Patty Murray, who's the senior Democrat on the committee from Washington State. That bill expired 5 years ago. Congress has failed to fix it since then. I believe we're going to be successful this year. The House has passed its version. We'll either pass our version today or early next week, and then we'll put it together with the House and hopefully and send it to the President in a form that hopefully he can sign. This year, we're going to fix it. Then we're going to turn our attention to a bipartisan Higher Education Act. I'm going to work on it with Senator Murray in the same way we did No Child Left Behind, which is that she and I will first write a proposal and submit it to our very diverse committee, which has 22 senators, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren on one end, Rand Paul, Tim Scott on the other end. So it's an interesting discussion we have every time we get together. Although every single one voted to report our No Child Left Behind bill out of committee, which was a huge success. But we've already got a bipartisan head start on the Higher Education Act in 2 or 3 ways. I mentioned this big, long form. Senator Michael Bennet and I and several other senators of both parties have introduced what we call the FAST Act to make a number of changes in making it easier and simpler to apply for student aid. One of the most common sense ideas, in addition to simplifying the number of questions, is to allow students to fill that form out in their junior year in high school. This form that I held up requires you to fill it out, requires you to tell what your tax returns are before you file your tax returns. So it throws 20 million families into, confusion. If you let people fill that out in their junior year in high school, then they can fill out tax forms from a prior year, and then they can have a full year to look at colleges and universities knowing in advance how much grants and loans they're eligible for. So that FAST Act has been introduced and examined carefully, has bipartisan support. We're planning to introduce as many of the maybe 36 of the recommendations from the Zeppos-Kerwin report on higher education on how to simplify regulations. That'll be a bipartisan start. And Senator Burr and Senator Angus King and a group of bipartisan senators have introduced legislation on simplifying the repayment form for student loans. There are 9 different ways to repay your student loan. Actually, it's a very generous system. You can pay it off over 10 years by paying no more than 10% of your disposable income. And if that doesn't pay it off after 20 years, it's forgiven. But the process is so complicated that most students don't take advantage of it. So there's 3 steps already that we've taken. And we have maybe the most important step of all is we've worked together so far this year in a very bipartisan way in our committee to work on elementary and secondary education, so there's no reason we can't continue to do that with higher education. I hope that Senator Murray and I can report our bill to the full committee in September, as we did with No Child Left Behind. It will be a suggestion for how the committee can work, and shortly thereafter, I hope we'll report it to the floor. Senator McConnell is very pleased with the debate on the Elementary and Secondary Act, the fact that we're working on something important in a bipartisan way and going to get a result that's good for the country. And so he told me last night that he's very interested in our Higher Education Act, and he'll work hard to find floor time for it. So I'm optimistic about that and look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Alexander. A lot of food for thought there. In the interest of time, I want to open it up for questions. I had a list of my own questions, but we'll skip over those and open it up to the floor. Please raise your hand, identify yourself by name and affiliation, and ask a question, most importantly. No statements from the floor. Let's go right here to start.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. I'm Allie Grassgreen from Politico. I have sort of a two-part question. First of all, do you still think there's a chance that the committee could try to address or repeal gainful employment in the Higher Education Act reauthorization? And secondly, assuming gainful does stay intact, considering the fact that that regulation is in place and the college ratings are now not really happening, what do you think is the most effective and equitable way to ensure that all institutions are going to be held accountable for their performance regardless of institution type?
Well, the short answer is I hope we can repeal gainful employment. It's a big, clumsy, burdensome 800-page rule directed at one segment of higher education, and it will throw a lot of hundreds of thousands of students out of their post-secondary opportunities. We were talking around the office that based on its application, if all of the political science students at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville were to go to work on Capitol Hill, UT Knoxville would have to shut its political science program if the gainful employment applied to it because they wouldn't earn enough money. So it's a very clumsy way to get at a problem. A better way to do it would be to some broad incentive that encourages colleges and universities to help students make wiser decisions about borrowing. And one way to do that might be risk sharing, the idea that a college or a university might share in some of the responsibility for a student defaulting. If we do that, we're going to have to make some other changes in the student loan program. One would be to allow colleges and universities to do more counseling. Right now, we make it difficult for them to do it by regulation. And another change might be to change the law so that you're not entitled to a full loan, even if you're just a part-time student. So we've got some procedures in the law that actually encourage overborrowing.
I'm sorry, but in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to let Senator Alexander go.
Well, we can take a couple more. I don't.
Okay. All right.
I spoke a little long, which is not unusual for senators.
I'm overruled. That's fine with me. Let's see. We got one in the back. We'll be equitable. He's hiding behind the pillars.
Hi, Mike Goldstein, Cooley. I go back to when the Higher Education Act was first enacted, and it's essentially the same as it's been for 50 years. It's based on time and place, credit hours, accumulate 120 credits, you get a baccalaureate degree. You said with approval models like Southern New Hampshire University, College for America, which is competency-based. Do you see competency-based learning like College for America, like Western Governors and others, as part of the new Higher Education Act?
Yes, I do. And your observation's a very good one. The question is just exactly how to do that. But the point is, why measure all this based upon the hours you're sitting in class when a more accurate measure might be what you actually know? And if there's a way to do that and still be responsible with taxpayers' money, we should do that. And we're looking very hard at how to change a whole series of definitions in the existing Higher Education Act that interfere with competency-based education.
Take another one if we have a minute. Right up front.
Peggy Yarchowski, I'm congressional correspondent with a Hispanic outlook on higher education. The quick question, are you expecting perhaps the higher ed reauthorization this year, 2015, or maybe 2016, the floor time? And I also wanted to ask you, do you think the Supreme Court taking up affirmative action will have any effect on what you're doing in terms of higher ed reauthorization?
Well, number one, I expect we'll be finished in the committee this year, hopefully by October. Whether it goes to the floor depends on Senator McConnell. So I was encouraged when he encouraged me last night to say he really liked what we're doing on elementary and secondary education. He said, if you got anything else like that, let's get it done and have it ready. So what we're going to do is hand it to him. He can put it on the shelf, and when the Senate gets into trouble and can't agree on what to do, maybe he'll take it down. I think there'll be a lot of interest on higher education, the issues we've discussed, including simplifying student aid, making it easier to go to college, lots of Senators like to talk about that and do things about it. So as far as the floor time, I can't predict that. That would come later. As far as affirmative action, I was thinking back to December of 1990 when I was leaving the University of Tennessee and was introduced as the new nominee for Secretary of Education, and the issue was affirmative action for college, based on race for college students. And what I said at the time was I thought a university president with a good lawyer and a big heart could probably find ways within the existing system to offer deserving low-income students the financial aid they needed without basing it on race. I think that's where we're headed. I'm not sure we'll deal with it in the Higher Education Act. I suspect the Supreme Court may deal with it before, well, maybe not before we do, but in the same time we're doing it. I think increasingly public money, race-conscious spending of public money in a country as diverse and complicated as ours doesn't make good sense. It's not, I mean, we're one country, we're all Americans, and what we need to do is to direct financial aid toward students of all ages, of all races who actually need the help, not based upon their race.
Please join me in thanking Senator Alexander. Opening statements. We're going to just do a moderated Q&A, sort of back and forth among the panelists, and we'll walk through a set of questions. The first one that I'd like everybody to respond to get us started is, relates to the college ratings, the dreaded college ratings, or the now defunct college ratings, however you refer to them. Recently, the administration's endeavor to rate colleges came to a screeching halt. Now that the ratings are dead or significantly modified, I'd like to know, what do we learn from that effort, and where are we headed next in terms of federal reform efforts for higher education? Let's start. We can start with Ann. She's closest to me, so I'll pick on her first.
All right. Well, I certainly like ratings, and I think that we want as much information out there as possible so that consumers can make up their own mind. But I guess, is it the government's role to rate schools for purposes of Title IV? My answer is no, and so I'm glad that the Department, for better or for worse, concluded the same. But I do think there are some important lessons to be learned here as we look to the reform of federal role in quality assurance. First, the department has a role, but it's a limited role. The department role should be its current role, I would submit, namely to ensure that Title IV money goes only to schools that are financially stable. The financial responsibility test needs to be improved, but it is a test that can and should be done by the department. Second, I think the federal role of quality assurance should be focused on protecting students and taxpayers, and it should be efficient. The Obama administration has been absolutely right that the current system is a mess because it's opaque and it deceives students and families into thinking they're making a good investment in accredited schools. And I think we've seen that students are ending up, to their great surprise, with massive amounts of debt, often no degree. Taxpayers are ending up holding the bill. And it amounts really to consumer deception, not consumer protection. So I think that the system we have now does harm to students who have the fewest resources and the least familiarity with the higher education system. So the bottom line, having access to key information that goes directly to student academic success, should be the essential element in quality assurance. Transparency is where we want to end up.
Ben, you've done some time in the Department of Education. Were you surprised by this? And second, where do you think we're headed next?
Sure. So, I think it's an understandable decision because I think it was pretty clear from the get-go, based upon the responses from everyone, that data quality was going to be a major issue here. And I think that was something we knew, and I think this was basically a recognition that the quality of data just weren't going to be good enough to do every single thing the rating system wanted to do. And I think part of that speaks to some structural problems we have around data. Colleges basically just got this amazing benefit to them where for years they fought to make it harder to get the data we need to properly judge colleges. Then we tried to judge colleges. They said, well, you don't have the data you need, so we can't judge you. So it's basically like a have your cake and eat it too situation for them. But I think the other problem you saw here was the rating system was probably trying to do too many things at once. A rating system that's trying to focus on who is the absolute lowest in the system with respect to Title IV aid, that's a situation where we probably do have pretty good data coverage because the Department of Education has a comprehensive database of information on student loan borrowers. What it doesn't have is good indicators on completion for people who transfer, for people who go part-time, for the students who are really the people going to college today. So I think that was really the big issue with the rating system was if you try to rate every single college into some different category and you try to do it both for accountability and consumer purposes, you're trying to do too much and the data, because of structural limitations set by Congress, aren't going to be there for it. If you want to do a rating system that was who are the bottom actors with respect to Title IV aid to get at some of this consumer protection questions, I think you could have done a rating system that way, but that's not an aspirational thing. That is a sort of, we're going to come in here and try to kick out bad actors. There's no sort of reward or positive message there. But I hope going forward what this does is really show to us that we need to have a more concrete discussion as part of the HEA reauthorization about what data we do and don't have and why. Because I think that's the one thing I wish that had been more explicit from the department when it made its announcement, was that rather than just saying we think the data aren't there, being very explicit, these are the indicators we need, this is why we don't have them.
Kevin, agree, disagree, differ?
Different, I'd say, or agree on some, different on others. I guess what I would say is that I think the ratings taught us that, so the ratings are in this larger context of we've had this aid system that's focused on access for decades, and that's been a lot of the conversation, is how do we make sure that no student is denied access to higher education based on financial barriers. And more recently, in recent years and decades, we've had this shift in the conversation around how do we focus on value and completion and things like that so that people are actually getting something for their money. The ratings are obviously very much in that spirit, and so I guess what I would say is that now we need to think in a little bit more of a nuanced way about how we actually have that conversation around completion and value. Because when this doesn't come up just in higher education, it comes up in elementary and secondary education, it comes up in early ed, it comes up in healthcare. All these challenges are very similar. With all of these issues, all these policy areas, you have to consider the population that you're serving. You have to consider whether we can measure the outcomes we care about. You have to consider how we trade off the various outcomes and whether people have disagreements about those things. And so we know that going into all of these things. And so to me, the problem with the ratings was both that we lacked the data, but also across all these dimensions, it ran headlong right into all of these challenges that we knew existed. And I think the administration felt like through sheer will, they could just push this through the process, like somehow we can just sort of ride off a cliff with a reform flag flying and just like will this thing through. I think we just need to think differently about knowing these challenges. What are ways we can align the incentives of institutions with students, but do it in a way that's both more consistent with what the department is actually able to do well, and what's going to be sustainable in the political process and not have a lot of unintended consequences. And so I think risk sharing is much more promising because, like Ben said, we have the data. It's based on a much more firm principle of federal action, which is instead of just trying to create a performance accountability system where we like trade off all these different things that we care about and in which people have different preferences, we're actually trying to protect consumers who are taking out debt, and which is something I think a lot of people understand. And so I just think it rests on a whole firmer foundation than the rating system.
Judith, your membership serves as something of a ratings agency in terms of informing students about what's safe to invest in. What was your take on the college ratings?
Well, we at CHIA always thought that the rating system was not the best idea. The rating system had two elements. It had data on the one hand and analysis on the other. And what I think has just happened is that the department said, we're not going to do the analysis. But I'm not sure they've given up on the data. That is, whether it's in the department or in Congress, we hear two words all the time. One is outcomes, and the other is indicators. So my sense is that we're going to move toward some formalization of expectation of indicators of how well colleges and universities perform, whether this happens through some regulatory effort, separate bill, or the Higher Education Act. The thing that we've kind of given up on right now at the federal level is connecting the dots. Well, somebody else can do that. So I'm not sure that the spirit of ratings is gone. This one approach may have gone by the wayside. The implications there for accreditation are very interesting. If indeed we have indicators and somebody is connecting the dots, what does that mean for the judgment of accreditation with regard to the quality of an institution or program and for eligibility for Title IV? Will indicators and accreditation coexist? Which will be more important? Will they be equal in significance, or will there be an effort to incorporate expectations for accreditation into any effort to have indicators of the performance of a college or university?
So one of the things we just heard, and we heard Senator Alexander talk about at length, was the idea of risk sharing as a potential path to greater accountability. Simplest idea here being that colleges are on the hook financially for some portion of loans that go unpaid by their graduates or their dropouts, for that matter. It's an idea that's gotten a lot of attention. There are important caveats and criticisms of it, obviously. So I wanted to ask Ben, and this is broader than just risk sharing, but it has to do with ratings as well. Institutions often respond to accountability proposals by arguing that they'll admit fewer hard-to-serve students, raising concerns about higher ed access. How should we think about the trade-offs here between access and quality assurance?
Sure. So I think a couple sort of upfront points is, one, there's already a lot of colleges that have shown that have minimal interest in enrolling hard-to-serve students. And so anything you do should both be wary of people denying access, but also create incentives or maybe even so much as requirements to make people also have an access mission. Because colleges are tax exempt, they're supposed to be public charities. A lot of them aren't sort of fulfilling all of that part of the mission they should. But I think the other thing to understand here is a lot of times the way we talk about access in this country, I think, is a little bit too simplistic. We basically say that any spot anywhere is providing access, and that's not really true. I mean, a place that enrolls a student, charges them tons of money for something that's not very good, doesn't do anything to complete them, drops them out with a lot of debt, that's not access. You provide a spot to take their money, but you didn't provide a spot to serve them. So I think when we talk about an accountability system, one that results in fewer places being able to prey upon low-income students, that is a feature, not a bug of an accountability system. What you want an accountability system to avoid is a high-quality actor not being willing to serve at-risk students and things of that nature. Now, obviously, that quality question is important. Let's set it aside for the moment and talk about sort of how you could construct an accountability system to at least deal with this a little bit. I mean, I think part of it is, one, having minimum bars for the number of and percentage of at-risk students you serve so that you sort of can't have people just skirt away from that. So, a place like the University of Virginia with very, very low Pell Grant enrollment can't keep on doing that. Second, I think you need to explicitly measure the things you care about. Essentially, whenever you're talking about a ratings or an accountability system or a performance bar, all of those things you choose are value statements. So if you value the enrollment of at-risk and low-income students, measure their results. If you include that in there, then you basically are saying we want to make sure we're tracking this and how it's doing. And I think you track it not just in terms of percentages, but also numbers. Because if you track it in terms of numbers, then there is an incentive to serve them, because essentially if you serve more and do well with more, that reflects well on you. I think the third thing is it's very easy to be only punitive here, and that's the really important thing you have to avoid. If you only ding people for results with hard-to-reach students, then you do run the risk of having people not want to serve them. If there is a way to reward them, whether that's through greater flexibility, fewer reporting requirements, additional money, some sort of carrot, I think you counterbalance the concern, because you make it so that there is a strong incentive for them to want to do that because it's financially worthwhile for them. And then the last thing is I would just say is that we should probably think about this a little bit as who is the worst of the worst. And that gets back to my earlier point about sort of you don't want to make it so that in the process of not wanting to discourage good providers from serving at-risk students, that you keep allowing bad ones to just do it with as much as they want. And so I think if you start this basically saying who is taking our most vulnerable people and serving them the worst, that's a little bit less risky in terms of what do the good actors do with the at-risk students they're taking now.
So I'd like to hear some responses from the other panelists. I think in particular to the question around federal requirements around accessibility and low-income students. That was one thing the ratings tried to do with this measure of percent Pell. Do people have a response to Ben?
I guess I would say I would second Ben's notion first that I think we really need to broaden the conversation around access to say that access to what? Access to something that is actually a meaningful education. Andrew, I think you came up with this phrase once, access for access sake, which doesn't actually mean very much for a student, particularly when there's debt involved. And so I think we do need to think about the incentives that institutions face in serving other students. This came up in one of the papers I wrote for this project was this other, what can we learn from other sectors? And you look at other things like the Workforce Investment Act, where you have local boards that are supposed to be serving people, and there's evidence that they cream skim when they have an accountability system. And so this question obviously comes up in a lot of contexts. And so to me, we should rely on incentives such as like a Pell bonus or something like that to try and compensate for the fact that we know these students are more difficult to serve. I'm a little bit more hesitant to try and impose strict requirements. But one thing to think about, I guess there's two lessons that I drew from the workforce investment context, which was Things are very different when you're talking about something like WIA, where you're actually giving grant aid to people, and you can say, you know, this person might have a marginal chance of being successful as being served by this particular board, but it's a public priority to spend this money on them. It's a different thing to say in the context of lending people money that we think you have a marginal chance of being successful, but we're still going to lend it anyway because we're such nice people and we care about your welfare. The other thing about WIA is that WIA was your only provider. In the higher ed system, this particular school is not your only provider. There's lots of other providers. So particularly, again, in the context of debt, I think the question should be not do you not go to school or whether you go to school at this particular program that might not serve you well. It's can we get to you other programs? Are there other high-quality seats, just like Ben was saying, that we can get you into?
Judith, do you want to weigh in?
I have more questions than answers about risk sharing. I know I'm supposed to not like it, but I don't understand enough about it in order to say I don't like it. But one, it does raise, as do other policy issues out there right now, the issue of our national commitment to access. We've had a lot of discussions in the last few years, especially about completion and how important that there are results associated with a college degree. We heard that from the senator this morning again as well. Looking at the very big picture of the access commitment, what are we going to do going forward? Going back to the 60s, access was about opportunity. Are we going to curtail that opportunity for students or not? We're clearly not as willing to fund it as we once did. So I think risk sharing raises that issue in a variety of ways. I have a second question about the role of institutions. Institutions, at least when it comes to loans, have very limited authority to do anything, as, again, Senator Alexander alluded to this morning. What are we going to do to provide appropriate authority to institutions if we're going to hold them more accountable with regard to debt and default, if that dimension of risk sharing? How are we going to do that? And my third question, Andrew, is about how are we helping the taxpayer, especially when it comes to public institutions where the overwhelming majority of students are, all right? The taxpayer funds public institutions. We want to save the taxpayer money, that the cost of debt and default. How are we doing that if we simply shift the source to which the taxpayer is paying the money that'll be used to deal with default issues? And I don't have, again, answers to those questions, but I think this raises a huge set of policy issues to be discussed, and we can probably find solutions to them. My point isn't to raise them to say we can't do this. It's simply to raise them.
And arguably, if we had a accreditation system that protected students adequately, we may not need some of these other policies. You've been a vocal critic of accreditors, and you sit on the board that oversees them. You know, what I'd like to know is where do you think the current system is falling short? But beyond that, you know, there seems to be some broad agreement on where the system's falling short, but we always seem to get, you know, to the sticking point is what do we do about it, and how do we change the accreditation system, or how do we think about alternatives to it? So, two-part question for you.
Well, I think that's right, that there, I think, is a growing consensus that this is a system that is broken and it has not worked well. And I think Senator Alexander certainly said that in his comments, that it needed to be improved. I think we took a voluntary peer review system and we assumed that we could then make it a quality assurance program, and those two roles don't really work very well together. It's a schizophrenic arrangement, and that has not been healthy, and I think as a consequence we have a system where numerous institutions with single-digit graduation rates are accredited, and students are basically being deceived into thinking that they're going to get value if they put their money there. You can look at any number of studies, whether it's the National Assessment of Adult Literacy or the studies of Academically Adrift, I mean, showing time and time again that academic quality is going down, not going up, and this has been under the accreditation regime. For the last 50 plus years, we've had this regime. When we've had reauthorizations, we've tried to tweak around the edges. And I think it's time really to say that this inputs-oriented program has not worked and that we have to really undertake a much more radical look at how we can improve this. And I think we were talking earlier, what we need to do is focus on high-risk schools and find a way to expedite the system for low-risk schools. I mean, when you look today, places like Princeton, places like Michigan and Stanford, I mean, whatever criticisms you want to make about them, and you can, notwithstanding, they are providing educational quality in any conventional sense of the word, and yet they are paying millions of dollars, hiring extra employees, outfitting rooms with reams of paper in order to get accredited, and this, I think, is ridiculous. So as we prepare for the reauthorization, I certainly second and applaud Senator Alexander's conclusion that the regional accrediting cartels make no sense in a world of global education. I hope that the Senate will look very closely at what we refer to as the blank check authorization in the statute, which has empowered accreditors, particularly the regionals, to engage in very intrusive regulation that undermines institutional autonomy and the ability of boards, faculty, and administrators to work with their management and to make those kinds of decisions. Senator Alexander was concerned about autonomy, and frankly, we have seen massive invasion into the autonomy of our institutions. And last but not least, I think we can really develop a system that will allow accreditors to focus on the most problematic schools. How would we do this? We would set up a parallel system of quality assurance that allows low-risk schools effectively an easy on-ramp to Title IV. What would this mean? They would have to ensure financial stability, as we already require. They would provide some basic information central to decision-making, such as consumer data on graduation rates, demographic success, costs, and they would have to show proof of student learning. Now, this would be a system that would be very receptive to diverse populations because rather than just focusing on reputation, it would allow institutions to show whether or not they're adding value for student populations. And how would schools do this? They would be able to pick any nationally normed test to show how they are doing with their students. It could be through an ACT or an SAT, or they could use an exam like the CLA Plus or the ETS proficiency profile, which basically allows an institution to look at the students it has and to show value added. So it addresses the students where you find them. And so this would be a way for these schools that are financially stable, provide information for the consumer, and show learning gains to get Title IV directly. And it could be easily implemented through NASIKI, which is certainly one of the things that's under consideration, empowering NASIKI to do a bit more. And in the meantime, the high-risk schools would remain within the accreditation system where the accreditors could focus more on their problems.
Judith, I'd like to hear your responses to those ideas, but just more broadly, accreditors have been beat up quite a bit lately. The Wall Street Journal did a long investigative piece on the state of accreditation. And do you think that the criticism is overblown, or are accreditors blamed for things that are out of their control?
Andrew, first, I might point out that CHIA also reviews accrediting organizations for quality. We're, if you will, the private sector analog of what the federal government does with a committee on recognition that is the analog of the National Advisory Committee. Ann and I do agree about the importance of independence and autonomy for colleges and universities. I would respectfully disagree that the system of accreditation is broken and not working, and I certainly don't agree that our mental health is failing and that we're schizophrenic. That said, yes, there's a lot of criticism of accreditation. I think it's overblown in the sense that the focus is on criticizing, looking to speak to problems that accreditation has, when I think the issue is somewhat different. Policymakers want more from accreditation. and it's the more on which we should be focused. Accreditation has looked at curriculum, faculty standards for many years, made judgments about quality, and policymakers, the public at least is reflected in press commentary and policy leaders, are saying, look, this isn't enough. We need more from accreditation. We need more evidence of performance, graduation, or completion of other educational goals. We need evidence of performance with regard to whether students are getting jobs and their earnings. We need evidence of performance in the arena of less debt and default. So there's a challenge for accreditation to do more and to address these issues, and the challenge is around how. Tomorrow, we at CHEER are bringing together people from 40 different accrediting organizations, regional accreditors, programmatic accreditors, accreditors in the career-related and faith-related sectors, and we're raising these questions. What is the more that we see we need to have to do, and how do we go about doing it? Do we need better indicators for performance? Do we need a better screen, for example, for bad actors? There's a lot of discussion about a quality floor. What about that? How are we doing the job with regard to information to the public? How do we work with the department, with the states in what was once the triad, to make sure that students have access to reliable quality higher education? So I would frame this as, what more do we need from accreditation? How can we keep the strengths of the system we have had? It has served us well for many, many decades. How do we keep those strengths? And that's tied to the autonomy and independence of institutions. And at the same time, help accreditation build the capacity to do the more that Congress, the department, and the public are all seeking.
So I want to throw this accreditation issue open to both Ben and Kevin. I know you both have written a lot about it. Where do you sit, potentially in between Judith and Ann, or outside of them? Either one of you can start first. So.
Sure. So, I think I agree with some parts of what each of you were saying. I mean, I think on the one hand, accreditors do get a lot of flack, and I think some of that flack is essentially because of failures of state and federal leadership. Some of these questions about shutting down bad actors really can't only be on these small nonprofit organizations. If you're expecting a small nonprofit to be able to stand up to a giant national corporation, it's probably not going to happen. So I sort of see that. But at the same time, I think accreditors, there's been several things over the last couple of years that I don't know how you can look at that and think it's possibly excusable. In the couple months before Corinthian colleges imploded, it had some of its campuses had their accreditation recertified. Some of the accreditors actually even caught the exact same job placement problems that eventually caused some of the Corinthian campuses to lose Title IV access. But the problem is they didn't do anything. They basically said, come back to us in about a year and fix it. This doesn't look right. And I think you see this again and again, where it's, in some ways, the focus seems to be so much on improvement that even when you see something that looks so fatally flawed that you can't imagine a world in which it should possibly be allowed to improve because it's basically fraud, they still try to say, we'll just improve in a year and come back. And I think at some point, a clearer designation about what's accreditation's role in improvement and what's accreditation's role in terms of in and out are sort of different, and recognizing that distinction a bit. I think a lot of the things about different levels of flexibility would be helpful here. It's pretty clear that just saying you're either approved for all Title IV or no Title IV basically is a nuclear option that encourages either creating Animal House levels of probation that don't mean anything, or like taking dollars away, in which case you're going to end up in court. I mean, there was a college in Baltimore that lost accreditation a year ago that is now suing its accreditor. So I think some degree of flexibility here would be helpful, but the other problem is it's not clear to me that accreditation on the inside wants to reform itself. I thought one of the most promising steps for accreditors was there was going to be this new teacher prep accreditor form called, I believe it was CAPE. And one of the things it wanted to do was some semblance of a tiered accreditation. Now, granted, it's for teacher preps, not for institutions, et cetera, but I thought it was pretty interesting. It was pretty thoughtful. It looked like they had more interesting standards. Essentially, there was a coup, and the guy who was heading that organization was fired. And so if accreditors don't want to change themselves from within, I don't know how we can just change the system. They have to want to change what they're doing. And so far, I just don't see the evidence that there's enough tolerance of that. And I don't know if it's because of the boards of accreditors, because of the leadership. I don't know where that breakdown's occurring, but it's clear to me that's happening. And then the other thing I would just say really quick is, it's pretty clear that the regionals have problems, but our national accreditation system is also a mess. I mean, it's hard to look at some of the national accreditors that were approving things like Corinthian colleges and think that they were doing anything resembling quality assurance. I mean, I don't know how you could look at those results and sort of feel like that was acceptable.
Kevin, I know you're skeptical about organizational change on the magnitude that we might be talking about here with respect to accreditors. What's your sense of the avenues for reform and the current problems?
Yeah, so I guess I would take Ann's notion that I think accreditation was a process built around self-improvement a long time ago, and I think that is still kind of in the bones of these organizations. And I would certainly welcome everything Judith has said about the work that you guys are doing on reform, but I also think that there's ways in which we might try and build some organizations from the ground up too. And in some of my research on this project, I looked at charter authorizing because I think some of the best charter authorizers are a little bit of a better model in terms of what we might be looking for. I mean, that these authorizers have independence from the political process, from the institutions that they're regulating. As Ben was saying, the best ones use kind of a tiered process of risk-based oversight where it's, when an institution is first coming in, we're looking much more closely at what you're doing and your business plan and whether this is a serious operation. And then as you develop outcomes, then we're backing off a little bit and giving you more autonomy. And so, entities that are staffed in a way where their understanding of what what their purpose for being is essentially to try and give these organizations as much autonomy as possible in terms of how they do their job, but at the same time be informed by outcomes and other signals as to whether quality is actually happening, I think is what the role of these organizations should be. And so I think we should, as much as possible, try and look to that model. And it's not always accreditors' fault. I mean, there's certain things that we write in statute that we impose on them in statute that we should look at too. And so I think, we should look both at those regulations and then potentially some new blood.
We're going to go to Ann and then Judith quickly for quick responses.
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, when we think about Corinthian, obviously we've seen that as a failing. But let's look at the University of North Carolina. For 16 years, major academic fraud was going on. Where was the accrediting body? So I think that pretty soon you can have enough anecdotes that you create data which would suggest that the system is really not working very well, which is why I think it is important to get back to a simple system that demands financial stability, that shows the consumer that's financially stable and that it's audited so that you have an independent authorization that provides consumers with information, something that we do not get now in accreditation, which is virtually opaque, and that focuses on student learning. I mean, when we look at the Higher Education Act, we wanted to have guarantors of educational quality. That's what accreditors were set up to do. And as I listened to Judith, as the groups are going to get together yet again, and they're going to sit down and they're going to analyze what it is they should be doing and what they should be analyzing and what they should be thinking about, student learning. I mean, that's what it said in the Higher Education Act. So let's value the schools that can show that students are having educational gains there. They don't have to be ones with high reputation. Let them be ones that are doing a good job with the students that come there so that we can absolutely give the Title IV funds to successful schools. And then if we have to find a way to deal with more problematic, then I'm willing to let the accreditors deal with those, but then let's set free a large segment of schools that don't need to have this kind of intrusion.
Judith.
I acknowledge a number of the problems that have been raised here, as would anyone in traditional accreditation, and that's part of why we're meeting tomorrow. The issue is, can we come up with some solutions? I don't think accreditation is going to be able to do this all by itself, and I acknowledge the difficulty of change from within. At the same time, if you look at the capacity for change of accreditation over the years, it is impressive. If you look at what has happened with accreditation in the last 10 years, with regard to attention to outcomes, with regard to greater transparency, that is impressive. expensive as well. Are there problems? Yes, there are some problems that need to be addressed. But we'll see what we'll be able to do. This doesn't preclude either trying alternative forms of quality review, and I'm really interested in what you're pursuing here. And there have been other discussions of alternative quality review, and I think that's healthy for the dialogue as well. So while yes, we point to shortcomings, at the same time to categorically claim that accreditation is utterly ineffective is where I really push back.
So I want to make sure we leave some time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to jump to what was to be my last question, and this is for the entire panel. We can figure out who goes first, but how does the growing popularity of free college affect policy debates around these issues of quality assurance and accountability and consumer choice and transparency? Does this change the discussion we're having? Does it render some of the conversation moot? Why don't we start with, we'll start in the middle. We'll start with Kevin or Ben. Let's start with Kevin, sure. And then we'll just go across the panel, and then we'll do some Q&A.
Yeah, I guess my thinking on free college, or at least the way in which it impacts this debate, is that there's a lot of different ways people look at free college. They say, oh, it's a new investment in spending. It is that. They say it's gonna. Sorry, I'm totally drawing a blank here. I guess what I was going to try and focus on was, to me, the biggest, or it has strings attached, so it's going to incentivize states to do accountability mechanisms. To me, the biggest thing that it would do that would shape this debate is it really moves us away from kind of a market choice-based system that our higher ed system has been for decades, and much more towards something closer to like a traditional public school model in K-12. And for better or worse, I would argue that it's for worse. And to me, some might say that it addresses the quality issues because we get those pesky for-profits out, or we make it harder for them to survive. But to me, it really kind of pushes the quality issue under the rug a little bit, that none of those issues go away. We still have to be concerned about the quality of the public institutions that we're then funding. Then we still have to then create accountability mechanisms. I mean, we encounter this all in the K-12 environment. So to me, it's a mistake to lock down the supply side in that way and start to channel all of our money through institutional subsidies. We'd be better off leaving the innovation and dynamism that can come from having a more vibrant system, but then focus on aligning the incentives of institutions with their students.
Ben, what do you think? Sitting at that bastion of progressive thought, Center for American Progress.
So, a couple things. I mean, I think there are multiple dimensions of quality, and in some ways, this is what makes our quality assurance discussion so complicated right now, because there's essentially a cost or financial element of quality, then there's the learning pieces, and they're sort of connected and they're sort of not. I mean, there's some degree of learning that if you charge $100,000 for the best cosmetology program in the country, that's not quality, right? Like, that's learning quality, but not financial quality. So in some ways, if you set aside the cost issue, that does free up, I think, some time to have discussions around what is the actual learning quality. And it also probably gives some greater leverage for the states to do something about it. Because one of the problems you have right now is that basically the trade that a lot of colleges are sort of trying to approach with some states, or certainly at least the flagship colleges, is basically saying, we'll just stop taking your money because you're giving us so little right now that it's not worth it, and just free us to do whatever we want. And I do think that has some big problems and implications if that's the road we end up going down, because the idea of having a public, affordable option in each state, I think, is very important. And if the flagships decide they want to instead be like the elite nonprofits and sort of not be as committed to access and things like that, that's a problem. And in some ways, if you were to be able to deal with this cost issue a little bit, you can then pivot and think about other questions that matter. I mean, it's the same thing we saw where by getting rid of the banks and the student loan system, we could start having broader discussions about performance and quality at the program level, whether that's through gainful employment, question how the loans are actually performing, which is something no one ever asked because we were so busy fighting, like, what's the best way to issue a loan? And so I do think it has some benefits. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of details to be worked out. The definition of free varies a ton person to person. The thing that is free varies a ton person to person. I mean, you saw this a little bit in the conversation about what college costs now, where you heard, oh, college actually isn't that expensive, but really that's the tuition and fees. We know that living expenses matter as well. So I think it's a good thing to have on the table as an aspirational discussion, and it gives us a place to start thinking about sort of what is financial quality or what is pricing quality here, and that I think also frees up space to then separate that a little bit from the learning piece, which we also need to address more.
Anne?
Well, again, the old saw, you get what you pay for. If you're getting free education and it means you're going to graduate 20%, that's not worth paying for or not paying for. So I just think the focus on the free takes away the focus on what we should be looking at, which is whether or not these schools are adding educational value and providing learning gains for students. And I also think that when we look at this very dynamic higher education landscape, where we're seeing the unbundling and various provisions of education online and otherwise, boot camps, et cetera, I think we want to have a policy landscape that encourages the use of various other ways of finding education rather than privileging one kind.
Judith?
Well, as Mike Goldstein, who spoke earlier, said at our workshop a few weeks ago, free college isn't free, it's that somebody else pays. And we need to keep that in mind. One of my biggest concerns is we're to move in this direction would be the high likelihood, if the money's coming from the federal government in particular, of a good deal more federal control over colleges and universities and more federal defining of what counts as quality. And I don't think we can sustain the diversity of higher education we have, its independence and its autonomy, as the senator said earlier, that has made the system so strong and so viable in the face of radically extending federal control of our system.
We've got about 7 minutes or so for some questions from the audience. We've got some mics circulating around. Please raise your hand, wait for the mic, identify yourself by name and affiliation, and ask a question. Most important rule is the last one. Let's go right up front here.
Thank you. My name is Greg Sheckman. I serve as a commissioner on the Maryland Higher Education Commission. There's been some references to what the state's role is going to be in the HEA reauthorization. I didn't hear any discussion about SARA and whether that's going to play a role, if that's the right direction to move for states. States have this consumer protection responsibility. We also want to make sure that we provide as much access and opportunity for students to pursue whatever post-secondary education they want to do. So I'd appreciate comments.
A quick definition of SARA, it's a reciprocity agreement between states to allow online providers to serve students more easily. It's basically, if you're an online provider who's approved to serve in one state and you have an agreement with another, you can serve the students without having to go through a separate authorization process. It's a simplified way to describe it. Judith?
Just a couple things, and we have long supported SARA. I think it's a good concept at CHIA. My understanding is there is not any particular interest here in Washington for building a reciprocity agreement approach into the reauthorization. Now that may be changing or has changed or will change. And second, what I think, this doesn't solve a damn thing, what I'm about to say, what I think is most fascinating with regard to the states about what's going on right now is the significant expansion of the federal government into the consumer protection arena when the traditional role of the states has been, as you just said, consumer protection. To me, it's parallel to the expansion of federal authority in the quality assurance realm.
I'll say something very quickly, which is that we did a lot of research on state policy as part of this grant, and SARA makes a lot of sense to me. I guess a broader point would be looking at the way states perform their consumer protection role. A lot of the things they ask look a lot like the questions accreditors ask, different forms. And so in thinking about ways we can make the system both more based on educational quality and less on how many inputs you measure, I think states also can look at how they can do things differently to get at those things. And SARA is one way to do that.
Take a couple more here before we adjourn. We got one right here. We have a mic close by. That gentleman.
Hi, I'm Frank Ballman at the National Association of State Student Grant Aid Programs. Relative to, say, access and accountability and all that, whether I'm a federal taxpayer or state taxpayer, probably I have more interest in the performance of the people who gave a Pell Grant to or a state grant to. So I'm curious if you think the low-hanging fruit here on access and accountability would be to focus not on, say, graduation rates and default rates and loan repayment rate, but looking at them for a Pell Grant recipient, realizing that a Pell Grant recipient at Harvard is much better prepared than at a community college. But it seems to me that I want to focus on those numbers to see what is my return in terms of my turning this person into a taxpayer.
Pell Grant accountability, it sounds like the question is.
So, I mean, I think we need to be much more aware of how colleges are serving our most vulnerable students. I think there are some efforts to try and get at that right now a little bit through the National Student Loan Data System, but it's sort of imperfect the way it's currently constructed to really measure Pell completion rates. And, we know there's a provision that's in the last HEA saying that colleges are supposed to be reporting this information. And Andrew, along with my former boss, Kevin Carey, did a paper that basically found no one's following that rule. So I think we need to do more. The problem is I think you need context for it. It's hard to just look at that number and say, is that good or bad? Should they be doing better or worse without knowing how everybody else is doing? And I think that's why we need a better data system overall so that you can start asking these questions, sort of how are they serving their Pell students compared to their wealthier students, compared to their loan borrowers, things like that. And the other thing I would just say is I think the level of necessary accountability on loans has to be higher than it is around grants, because a grant that doesn't pay off for the student is not going to really be doing lasting damage to them. There's a time loss to them, which is important, especially when you're talking about adults who have limited time to go back to school. But a loan that doesn't pay off, as you heard, people who drop out with debt are much more likely to end up in default than people who complete with debt. And so I think the level of accountability really needs to be much more about how are loan borrowers faring and what are we doing in terms of the amount of debt we're giving to people. Because if we're over-indebting low-income people, we're really making it very risky for them to go to college in a way we shouldn't.
Do you want to jump in there?
Sure, I just agree with what Ben said, but I'd also add, I think there's ways we could think about Pell Grant accountability, and sometimes we make the perfect enemy the good. I think even thinking about a floor would be worthwhile. The administration had something in their ratings proposal called substantial employment. Essentially, if a certain fraction of your graduates were earning a basic minimum, like 150% of the poverty line, I would not be opposed to something that basically said, look, if like a huge fraction of your Pell recipients are earning below 150% of the poverty line, it's hard to call yourself a school.
And jump in.
And just following up on that, the proposal that I presented where we have more data for consumers could include this. So you could see what percentage are actually receiving Pell Grants, and you can look to see what is the success of that, or are they having student learning gains. So this could be a piece of the consumer information that we could make available along with financial stability and proof of student learning gains.
We'll take one more. We got 1 minute. Who wants to ask the last question here? Let's go to the back here.
Thank you. Deborah Seymour from the American Council on Education. And actually, this is a question directed at a comment that Anne made with respect to accreditation. I think you, whether intentionally or not, when you commented on the peer review system that's inherent in current accreditation, you sort of pitted the idea of peer review against the idea of quality assurance. And I was wondering if you or others on the panel could elaborate on that, since those two don't seem to be in conflict to me.
I think we can actually look at statements by accreditors on this very issue, that they view self-improvement as very different from closing down a school. And that, in fact, they find it very difficult to close down a school. And I've talked to accreditors in the course of the last 10 years or so, and what they will say is, we are giving access to students to schools, and we would feel that we would be doing them a disservice to shut down a school where they could no longer use their Title IV money. This gets back to the question in the debate we've already had. Is it access that we really care about, or is it student success? And I think the fact that most accreditors rarely close down a school, that there is always an excuse to continue to keep them operating, that they've been unwilling to make those decisions that say, we're not going to allow Title IV money to go here anymore, we're not going to let these kids be duped into thinking that they're making a good investment, shows to me how these two roles don't particularly work well together. And what I would love to see is really a much more vibrant marketplace of accreditors who can develop various skills, various levels of accreditation, very much like the LEED system. When we look at architecture, it's an entirely private system, gold, silver, platinum, and it is worked privately to be a real signifier of quality. And we don't have that in the current accreditation system.
Anybody else want to weigh in before we conclude? Ben, and then we'll go to Judith.
I mean, I think part of the problem is we've in some ways taken peer review for the actual looking at it and abandoned it for everything else here. So there's no incentive for a school to care who else is accredited by its same accreditor. And I think that raises some problems as well. You know, if getting into Title IV is the same regardless of the accreditor, you don't have any reason as to care about what your peer institutions are really doing, aside from like broad reputation of higher education. So I think we've sort of abandoned the notion that maybe other colleges should care. Like if you are Princeton, should you care who else Middle States is accrediting? Probably, but there's no reason for you to care. And the other thing we've done is we've probably defined peer too narrowly so that essentially you have nationals that are largely made up of the exact same types of colleges all overseeing each other. And you don't have as much diversity as you probably need. You know, I'm not saying that Princeton should go look at Jay's Technical Institute, but Princeton should probably care what like some of the schools in its general area are doing because that should affect its reputation a little bit.
Let's go to Judith.
Yeah, peer review has been the anchor of accreditation as well as it's been the anchor in a number of other fields, and I'm thinking of medicine. In particular, peer review is not equated only with quality improvement. It's equated as well with quality assurance, which is reviewing an institution or program for threshold quality. And peer review has been the essential staple that has helped our colleges and universities get to where they are today. There is an enormous amount of competition, Ben, in higher education, and it does matter how you're accredited and by whom, and it does matter how well you're doing within a particular accrediting organization. But the issue here isn't, oh, we have peer review and it doesn't work and we have to throw out the system. The issue here, again, is how can we work with accreditation to strengthen it in areas where strengthening is called for given the changing conditions of higher education. Accreditation bashing gets us nowhere. I don't know why we continue it.
Please join me in thanking the panelists. Terrific discussion. And thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your summer.